Hey guys, what's up? Welcome back to the channel. It's Cynic Alex. And today I want to show you the most important skill in Marvel Future Fight. And this skill is going to impact every game mode that you play, and it's going to be the difference between average or below average players and excellent players. And that is, of course, timing your damage procs. And you're going to hear the word proc a lot, you're going to hear the word DPS, and you're going to hear all these terms, and I'll try to explain things as we go along, but the essence of what I'm discussing is basically one of the highest skill caps in the game. And as I've mentioned before in previous videos, I don't think Marvel Future Fight is a very high skill game with a very high skill cap, but this particular skill is one that you will need to practice if you want to get better at it, and it is definitely going to improve how well you can play and how far you can push your gameplay in this game. Now, for this test, for the first test anyways, we're going to be taking Thor, Black Panther, and Quicksilver. All three of these characters I have equipped with an obelisk that has a damage proc. And if you don't know what a damage proc is, it's that number at the bottom there in green, increases damage by X% for one attack. And they come in different flavors. They cap out at 200% increased damage. And anything above that or anything below 100% is not a damage proc. It's something else entirely. Black Panther's got that one there, 180 as well, and then Quicksilver is also rocking a 180 with guard break. And I've chosen these three characters and I've chosen this team up because there's no other influencers here on their damage. We're going to be taking this into a World Boss Ultimate stage against Proxima where there's no damage differences and there's no kind of reduction, and we're just going to be doing a pretty straightforward stage 15. This is not too difficult, this is not too easy, but it'll show you very clearly when I am hitting the proc, when it's being timed correctly versus when I am missing the proc, and that's basically when I'm doing it off of the timing and therefore losing a bunch of damage. So we're going to dive in here. No strikers. I don't want any kind of interruption or manipulation of the damage, and I basically want you to look at, in order to understand what I'm doing here, you're going to look at Thor's portrait just to the right. You're going to see a green gear icon, and I'm going to hover over it now at the beginning of the fight, and I'm just going to kite Proxima just so you guys can see what I'm talking about. And it's this icon right here. This is the custom gear icon. It's going to be the same on all of your characters. It's always the second one. You can see as I switch through, it's always there. And that's what you want to keep an eye on for your damage proc. As soon as it turns green, and it turns green with a 10% chance when you're attacking, that turning green is the moment when you want to then trigger your damaging skill. Now, some characters it's going to differ a little bit. You may want to start that skill slightly before the proc activates, but in general, once you see the green symbol, once you see the symbol turn green, or once you see a light blue text on the screen, because it's both indicators, that is your kind of green light, your go light to start your proc. So I'm going to try to get it here with Quicksilver's 5th and 4th skill. You can see there it triggered. It's got 3 seconds, countdown, 2 seconds, 1 second. That was a successful proc. That took down about a bar and a quarter, so 1.25 damage worth of bars. Now I'm going to lose the proc. I'm basically going to miss the proc by canceling the 5th skill too slowly. So we're going to see it here, and now I've done the same 2 skills, 5 and 4, but you can see that my proc is no longer counting down, and the damage was much less. I did basically another quarter of a bar. So you can see the difference there is gigantic. We've got a bar and a quarter versus a quarter bar. Now, in this case, what's happening is that I missed the proc on the 2nd skill rotation. So the second time that I did 5 and 4, the proc activated on Quicksilver's 5th skill. And in that case, Quicksilver's 5th skill is much less damage. It does much less damage. And what I think happened is, to get into the technicalities of it, one of the hits of the tornado was buffed for that 180%. And now in the first instance, which I'll now show you again, I cancel the 5th skill into the 4th skill instantly. And that's why the proc counts down. It doesn't go gray immediately. It counts down from 5 to 0 because it's buffing his 4th skill for the entirety. And that is essentially the way that the text works. It says it will increase the damage for 1 attack. Now, the 1 attack is 1 skill, and the amount that it increases it by, of course, is between 100 and 180%, but it's for the duration of either the full attack or the 5 seconds, whichever comes first. So in the case of someone like Anti-Man or Cable, who can hold a skill with their channeling skill, you can basically hold it until the proc is finished, until that 5 seconds is over, and then you can turn it off. You can cancel your skill, you can move your character's joystick around to interrupt the skill as soon as the proc has finished, and then you can start up again. I'll show you guys another situation here with Black Panther. We're going to do his 4th skill, and then we're quickly going to cancel into his 3rd skill, and then we're going to do his 5th skill. Here I was off at the beginning, and because I stayed in the same skill, the damage proc didn't terminate. And so that's an important thing to know, that if you start a skill and the proc triggers in the middle of the skill, it may end up buffing part of that skill but not the entirety of the skill. So we actually just lost Black Panther there, but I'll show you again here with Thor. The beginning of the 5th skill doesn't trigger the proc, and actually the proc doesn't trigger throughout the entirety of Thor's 5th skill. This is another problem that tends to happen at times when you're trying to time your damage proc. It's a 10% chance to happen, so there's a 90% chance that on any one given attack, any one given hit, it won't activate. In that case, you have to just get lucky. And that's why there can be some frustration when trying to clear very high level stages of World Boss Ultimate or very high scores of Extreme Alliance Battle, because those two game modes are where you will see the most variance in terms of the players who can time their procs 100% of the time. Those are the ones that get the highest scores in Extreme Alliance Battle. Those are the players that can push level 40, level 50 of World Boss Ultimate, versus players who, for whatever reason, timing, low level devices or lag, aren't able to hit their procs, and they're struggling to complete stage 20 or 25, or they're struggling to hit the same scores or even similar scores, even though their characters are geared the same way. So this is kind of the most difficult and also the most rewarding portion of the actual mechanics in the game that will reward high skill. But unfortunately, because there's only a 10% chance, there is a level and there's a component of luck involved. Secondly, I want to show you guys the difference in terms of not damage but numbers this time around with Extreme Alliance Battle. And this is basically the other game mode where you will be heavily rewarded for your ability to time your damage procs. And for those of you that have similar builds to, you know, my characters or other people's characters, but you aren't seeing the same returns on your scores, it's mostly tied down to your damage proc timing, and that's why you see so many players asking for things like a rotation. What's Cable's rotation? What's this character's skill rotation? That is essentially a quick and dirty cheat sheet for how you can time your damage procs, and usually the damage proc will want to trigger on the 1st or 2nd skills for the majority of characters' rotations. There's only a few characters where they leave that skill to the last or the 2nd last skill. That's usually for characters that have a channeling skill and they have many canceling skills. And I want to get into the skill canceling here to show you guys why not all characters are made equally when it comes to their ultimate DPS caps, because regardless of whether a character is strong or not in terms of your build, even with the optimal build, even with CTPs and perfect timing, some characters just can't do as much damage as others. Another note I want to make here really quickly at the beginning, why some people wait when they start an ABX battle, letting the Frost Beast kind of huff and puff here, largely has to do with the character they're playing and how easy or hard it is for them to trigger their damage proc. When you trigger the fight immediately as soon as the Frost Beast shows up, the summons, the clones, the Ultron robots won't be there. That is primarily for characters who don't want to trigger their damage proc too early. Characters like Anti-Man. So if you have a lot of skills that you need to wind up prior to your big damage skill to time with your proc, like Apocalypse, you don't want to have those clones, because every clone represents an enemy that can get hit, and every enemy that can get hit can trigger that 10% chance to activate your proc, and you want all those hits to land on the Frost Beast. Additionally, if you have a character that has lots of damage skills that have a very small AoE, or they have, you know, hits that can get carried away onto other enemies. For example, Apocalypse's 5th skill, you have the fists. If those fists hit the robots instead of the Frost Beasts, you get a much lower score added on. So in that case, you want to focus all of your damage, all of those canceling skills onto the Frost Beast, which is why you want to use the trigger to start the match early, before the summons have come in, before the robots have spawned. On the flip side, if your character has lots of AoE damage, you want the robots to be there when you spawn. Like now, we're going to spawn them because every robot that's there represents a chance for you to spawn your damage proc. So in this case, we're going to open with Elsa. We got the damage proc immediately on her 5th skill. We didn't actually do that much damage in terms of the points because the Frost Beast has a guard hit up right there. We triggered the proc again, but we triggered it on her 4th skill, so that was unintended, that was a mistake, and as a consequence, we're gonna have to try to get it back here. We triggered it again, there's the light blue text on top of Elsa, and there we got another score. In this case, I'm showing off Elsa because she is a relatively difficult character to time the damage proc for. When I get a successful damage proc for her, all other RNG permitting, she scores about 7,000. There, I was early, and I missed the proc, and her 5th skill only did about 1,000 or 2,000 points of damage. And you can measure your success rate with damage procs by measuring how much damage you're able to pull off. In this case, because I'm hitting the Frost Beast when he has a barrier up, and keep in mind this goes for any enemy that has a barrier up, your damage proc will not activate because you're not technically doing damage to the enemy. So at the beginning, I was able to trigger my damage proc because I hit one of the robots with the skill that was doing a damage proc. There, we still haven't seen it activate, but once we have the enemies behind us, we will be able to trigger it, but again, we're still early. But that's a character that's difficult. I want to show you now another character that's quite difficult to time their damage procs for, and that is Black Widow. Now, one of the things you want to look for when you're timing a damage proc is, of course, you want to identify the highest damage skill. For Black Widow, of course, that's her 5th skill. But in that case, the 5th skill didn't time the damage proc. It's still not activated. So what can I do? You want to identify on a character a secondary skill which doesn't necessarily do damage, or it does some damage, but it doesn't do a lot of damage, but it has a multitude of hits. Because if you don't have the robots around like that, you're going to need to rely on a skill like her 3rd skill or her 4th skill to do residual hits. And you can see there the baton that she throws is still hitting the Frost Beast. And if you time 3 and 4 and then go into 5, the blue text there was pretty close to the beginning of her 5th skill. You can essentially trigger it as it's happening. So there I was able to trigger it. The score difference is not that great for Black Widow in this case, so it's not very easy to see the difference in my score when my timing is on versus when my timing is off. But that is an indication that you can use, and that's a trick that you can use to try and assess a character's optimal skill rotation based on trying to time your damage proc as smoothly as possible. A third character that I want to show you guys is X23. And while X23 is not a bad character, she struggles massively from the difficulty of having very low AoE skills. And so in her case, all of her skills are single target or very close to single target. And so essentially the situation that a character like X23 creates is that if you're attacking the Frost Beast with no one around, it's much more difficult because of this single target focus to actually trigger a damage proc. And there, my damage proc only triggered after she hit with the final attack of her 5th skill, which has an AoE component. Now, if you'll pay attention to the score, she's going to get roughly 10,000 points when I'm able to properly time her damage proc, but because of the fact that all of her skills are single target, and because of the fact that I can't cancel any of her skills and leave those lingering damage hits, what ends up happening is things like that, where my proc triggered prematurely. It triggered on her 4th skill rather than her 5th skill, and it essentially leaves me doing much less damage. So in this case, for a character like X23, I basically have to gamble with each one of my rotations, and I have to hope that at the end of her 4th skill, when I cancel 4 into 5, my damage proc will trigger. In this case, when you have a situation like this where the proc triggered later on, you essentially have to delay your attacks in order to line them up. So that was a much better trigger. But we have another problem that we have to address with characters like X23, and that has to do with skill cooldown. The damage procs activate, or they work on a 7-second timer. There's 5 seconds for the buff, and there's a cooldown of 7 seconds. So that means in a perfect world, you can trigger your damage proc every 7 seconds. Now, we don't live in a perfect world, and RNG can be a bitch. So I would say it's more like 7.5 seconds. So if you have a skill like X23's 5th skill, while it does the most damage, you can see that it's on an 8-second, I didn't mean to get stunned there, but it's on an 8-second cooldown. That means that you do need to pause between skills, because if you just go through her rotation naturally without any breaks, you will eventually fall behind the damage proc, because it triggers every 7.5 seconds roughly, and your 5th skill triggers every 8 seconds because of skill cooldown. It's actually a little bit more than 8. It looks like it's between 8 and 9 seconds. So in that case, if you have a character whose skills don't have a 7 seconds or less cooldown, you come to an impasse, and essentially you can either use a different skill to try and trigger the damage proc 4 so that you can accommodate that proper cooldown and you can kind of line them up, or you have to create gaps where you just kite around and wait in between, like this. Because otherwise what ends up happening is you either get ahead of the proc if you have a skill with low cooldown, or you fall behind the proc. A character like Black Widow is a perfect example of getting ahead of the proc. Let's say I trigger it perfectly here on her 5th skill. Her 5th skill has a 6-second cooldown. So unfortunately, as soon as the skill's ready, I shouldn't press it. If I press it as soon as the 5th skill's ready, I'm going to be way ahead of the proc. And you can see there I waited about 2 seconds from when the skill was ready again before I actually triggered it, because there you go, blue text. If I don't do that, if I trigger the skill too early, I will be ahead of the proc and I will lose a bunch of points. Finally, I want to leave you guys with an example of the perfect damage proc character, and that is Cable, because of the way his skills are designed. The damage proc is best utilized by a single skill that triggers the proc, that deals high damage and has many attacks, because one skill with many attacks is the same as one skill with one attack, and the buff will apply to all of the attacks in that skill for the duration of the skill, or for the duration of 5 seconds, whichever comes first. So if you have a really heavy punch but it's only one hit, it's going to only get buffed once for 180%. But if you have a pretty heavy punch that hits 50 times in the span of 1 second, that's going to equal a lot more damage in the long run because of that 5 seconds of a buff from the damage proc. So his 5th skill, Cable's 5th skill, is perfect for a damage proc because of the fact that it has lots of hits that trigger in quick succession. It can take advantage of the proc. But that's only the first part of it. The second part of Cable's skills that makes him perfect for a damage proc is the fact that you can cancel them and still get their effects. His 4th skill, you can cancel it, you still get those blue vortexes, or those blue teleportations that summon the missiles. His 2nd skill is a delayed skill that summons lasers from the sky, which you can also cancel and still get their effects. His 3rd skill summons these floating knives, which also deal damage, which you can cancel and also get their effect. So because he has many canceling skills, you can kind of stack them up together and then finally land your 5th skill, and you can see the blue text activate custom gear effect, and you can ride out that damage proc for very buffed damage. But what makes him even better than that is the fact that you can continue to channel his 4th skill, and his 5th skill, and I'm going to show you what that means. So we channel, we have 4, 3, 2, 1 second left. We're going to leave it up as long as he doesn't die. With 1 second left, we go back into that rotation, and we're able to basically consistently keep this up as long as we don't die. Now, of course, dying is the the penalty and the weakness here, but for situations where the enemy is not as aggressive, for situations like Extreme Alliance Battle, you can essentially continuously keep your damage going, just canceling at the very last second before your next proc activates by doing that 4, 2, 3, 5 combo. So for characters like Cable, he really illustrates the pinnacle and the peak of damage proc related characters. So I would encourage you guys, if you're still having trouble timing your damage procs, take Cable into some gameplay, especially practice during Extreme Alliance Battle, because you can reset the stage. You can close your app on your phone before the timer expires and not lose your gold, and you can just keep practicing that stage, and you can see very clearly with the score at the top whether you're doing the proc correctly or not. Because if you land the proc, you're going to get damage, or you're going to get a score of 40,000 or 50,000 for that span of 5 seconds. If you miss your proc, if you're early or late, your score is going to be much less, 20,000, 30,000 at most. It's going to be a fraction of that. So those are my tips for the damage proc, for timing the damage proc, for recognizing what the damage proc is, and then for building skill rotations around specific characters in order to maximize their damage, starting with a skill that can trigger the damage proc, like Quicksilver's 5th skill, or Thor's 3rd skill, or Black Panther's 3rd skill, and then quickly canceling that into your main damage dealing skill, which is usually every character's 5th skill or 4th skill, and then riding that one out for the duration of the proc, or, you know, changing into other skills to wind up for your next proc in about 7 seconds later. So let me know what you guys think of all the tips. Let me know if you learned anything, even for you veterans who probably already knew a lot of what I explained. Subscribe if you enjoy the content and you want to support me. Hit the bell if you don't want to miss any of my videos. And of course, if you like what you see, I hope to see you again tomorrow. Take care.